Yeah. So without John's baptism, presumably there would not be Christian baptism, right? Because we have John the Baptist, and then Jesus being baptized by John, and then Christian baptism. And so the earliest source material we have connects these. If we ask, going back even a further step, what are the antecedents to John's baptism? We have John appearing on the scene in an era when, for some reason, it had become normative that to address purity, when the scriptures say to wash, that one immerses oneself fully. Right? There are lots of ways of washing oneself that do not involve full immersion, and so this is a very striking development, and we see it in the archaeological record. We have what's known as a mikveh, an immersion pool, and we have these appearing and becoming more and more common.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is James F McGrath. He'll tell you who he is in the introduction. We're going to be discussing his book, Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist. This is the first of two books coming out this year on John the Baptist, and it's written for a broad audience. So it's not bogged down with a lot of the details that scholars are going to be looking for. It's a really accessible read. I enjoyed it a lot. And I wanted to release this episode in time for people to still be able to pre-order it if they're interested in this book. So please, absolutely do that. It'll be out 11 June. This release date is 27 May. So you have a couple of weeks. You could pre-order the book and get it the day it comes out. The last thing I'll say before I move into the interview is please, if you have feedback, suggestions, or even just heavy-handed criticism, it means what it means at gmail.com. All one word, it means what it means at gmail.com. I hope you enjoy this interview with James McGrath. James McGrath, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be here with you, Jared.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a religious studies professor, mainly in New Testament at Butler University, which is in Indianapolis. I say mainly in New Testament because even though I have a chair that has that in the title, I also write on what were initially side interests, but now are competing with my primary interests, I think it's safe to say. So things about the intersection of religion and science, doing things on the Bible and music and things like that. But always come back to the New Testament. That was my first love. That's what I did my doctoral work in. And I just have a curious mind and a short attention span. And so I'm easily distracted by interesting new topics.
Which I think is a pretty good segue into this, because I have not come across a lot of people talking about John the Baptist. So the topic of our conversation is your book. Right now, we're talking a few months before it comes out, but Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist. It's actually one of two that you have coming out in 2024, correct?
That's correct. This was my first time adopting this approach to a writing project where I wrote a general audience book trying to be accessible and tell stories, visiting the Holy Land, going to other places, trying to make it interesting, acceptable, engaging for somebody without a lot of academic background, as well as the big, dense academic thing with all the footnotes and the primary source material in the original languages and all that kind of stuff. And so the book that is just out, in fact, I actually, as we were speaking just this morning when I came to work, I found that my early author copy actually came to me in the mail and was just here today. But that's Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist, and that's the general audience one. And then the bigger one is going to be called John of History, Baptist of Faith, and that should be out in October of this year if all goes well.
Fantastic. Okay, so feel free, if you want, to dip in and out of either book, either project.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that.
Sure.
I just want to learn more about John the Baptist.
Sure.
So this project, these projects, however you want to frame it, how did you get interested in this to start doing this research in the first place?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I'm easily distracted by new topics, and if I go through the things that have grabbed my interest previously, this research on John the Baptist kind of connected the dots between them in what I think are interesting ways. So my doctoral work was on the Gospel of John, and specifically on the way that Jesus is depicted in the Gospel of John, what scholars call its Christology. And it's certainly something that you can't miss, that John the Baptist is the first human character to appear in that gospel, as is true in a lot of the gospels, right? In the gospel tradition as a whole. Certainly you have the Word was in the beginning, but then in terms of what's happening on the human scene, John the Baptist is in that prologue of the Gospel of John, even before the statement that the Word became flesh, which presumably gets us to the life of Jesus. And that very fact is interesting and intriguing. I did not focus on it, as I was doing my doctoral work and trying to figure out why Jesus is depicted in the way that he is. Now I would certainly bring John the Baptist into that, answering that question if I were working on that now. But from there, I moved on to other things, continued to do things about monotheism and Christology, but moved on to doing some work on the historical figure of Jesus and other things related to Jesus in the Gospels. And then also did a little bit of writing, but also some teaching on extra canonical texts, both early Christian ones that reflected developing orthodoxy, but also some of the other ones. There was student interest in that, and so developed a course on that. And as I was doing that, that's when I came back across the Mandaeans. And they are a fascinating group that I'm guessing a lot of your listeners may not have heard of. And that's kind of forgivable, but it's also makes me very sad. And so hope to rectify that today and through those books. So the Mandaeans are essentially the last surviving Gnostic group from the ancient world, right? I mean, there are some, what I like to call neo-Gnostics, some who've decided to take up these things and make them part of their spirituality today. But those are recent developments, right? But this is one that has a continuous history going back into ancient times. And John the Baptist plays a central role in their storytelling, but they're not such big fans of Jesus, right? And so it's a very unusual configuration. And it has long been suggested that this group might have emerged out of followers of John the Baptist who did not embrace Jesus as sort of John's successor, the coming one, whatever else they might have thought he was. And so you come across the Mandaeans if you work on the Gospel of John, and so I was aware of them, but they were largely treated as kind of a relic of a bygone era in scholarly history. At one point, like first half of the 20th century, a lot of scholars were plugging them in as background to the Gospel of John. Maybe that's, they represent the views that the Gospel of John was arguing against. And then there was a backlash against that, saying, no, these texts are later, and so you can't use them in that way. And so one of the major things I try and do in this project is to bring those sources back into the picture and to make the case that they actually, they need to be used carefully and critically. They are later than the New Testament documents, and so you can't plug them as background. But they preserve, like rabbinic literature, like other things, they preserve some things from an earlier time. And so they are relevant to making sense of the origins of Christianity and of John the Baptist. And so having done some things on the Mandaeans, having done things on the historical Jesus, having done things on the Gospel of John, the John the Baptist project really allowed me to sort of tie some of those threads together and dig into some details that I had sort of neglected along the way in working on these other topics.
I accidentally found out about the Mandaeans. So I have a big project for the podcast where I want to talk to all the different traditions that engage biblical texts for their liturgical tradition. And I just accidentally, waiting for Chinese takeout on Christmas Eve, I think it was, I found these, like, wait, what? What is this? And I'm like reading the Wikipedia page, and then my order was ready, and I don't think I have thought to look back at them until reading your book. And I realized, like, oh man, I dropped the ball on that. I need to make a note to go back and find a way to contact them, because that's just, it's so weird that this group possibly came out of, I don't know, a similar origin to something that's, billions of people all over the world. And then in addition to that, like Judaism. So these are things that we all are familiar with. And then this little secret group, which is kind of appropriate for a Gnostic group. That existing in secret. Sorry, that's kind of rambling. I do notice over your shoulder, though. Is that supposed to be John the Baptist, the little figurine?
Yes.
Because I kind of want to
Yes.
get into appearance stuff. So I went into this, and I don't think you analogize John the Baptist to these characters, but I think I always pictured him as like Captain Caveman or Robin Williams in Jumanji. What? Oh, he's got the little
He's
bees.
got little bees on his sleeve. So a
Nice.
colleague gave this to me. I think a student gave him this figurine made by, I think the company's called Saint Zeppi. But yeah, he when I was working on this project, he was like, "Okay, this belongs in your hands rather than in mine."
So for
It,
listeners, it looks like Hagrid wearing like a brown toga almost. Is
yeah,
kind of how I would describe it.
and I think that if you ask somebody what does John the Baptist look like, the words, the name Hagrid and the brown toga will probably be part of the description. Otherwise, it'll be they'll imagine him wearing not clothing made of camel hair, but a camel hide, right? And so often, in fact, once I was giving a talk about this project, when I was still working on it, and was looking for images of John the Baptist to sort of talk about the stereotype and address this. And because Google search results connect similar images, and so I had lots of the John the Baptist, film and television appearances, and also, was it Michael York from 10,000 BC or 10 million BC or whatever the movie was about? And so basically a caveman, right? And
Okay.
I was like, oh, that's perfect, right? I mean, that Google associates that, says it's confirming this sense I have that people think you look like a caveman.
But he didn't.
I don't think he did, no. So I think that, camel hair, right, does not mean camel hide. And the idea that he was a raving, bug-eating lunatic that people gave a wide berth to. The Book of Acts says that he had, there were people who had been baptized with John's baptism in Ephesus, right? Christianity's getting there, and there are already some people who have some connection with John's baptism. You get Apollos seems to have been also a disciple, but knew only John's baptism, and then gets sorted out by Prisca and Aquila. And he had come from Alexandria. So it sounds like not only was John's movement having a huge impact in what we could broadly describe as the Holy Land, right, but further afield, right? And so that doesn't fit, right? Somebody who dresses like a caveman, I mean, maybe if they're an extremely charismatic caveman could have a certain influence, but it sounds like we've got some things about John wrong, given his influence, given how seriously he was being taken. And I spent a year-long sabbatical working on this, and if there's one thing I regret, it's that I didn't actually manage to work eating locusts into the picture as the part of the experience. So I got to go into lots of interesting places, do lots of interesting things, but I should have tasted at least one locust, because
There's
that
still
was
time.
actually not that. There's
There's
still
still
time.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
nothing stopping me now. I I've said to several people, I think that with the cicadas due to emerge again, I should have like a biblical cookbook. I could seize the marketing opportunity to how
Hurry
to
up.
cook cicadas with
Hurry
wild
up.
honey.
You don't have a
So
lot of time to get that out there.
no,
The
no.
cicadas are coming.
I keep saying that, but I never have enough. Like I don't actually have recipe ideas, right? And I don't have the time to, you have to wait for the cicadas to be out to try these recipes and develop new ones, and then it's kind of too late. You have to wait 17 years and then publish the next time around or something. So yeah, but eating locusts was not was not unusual. Why exactly the Gospels mention that he ate locusts and wild honey, whether that's wild bee honey or whether it's using the sort of colloquial term for date syrup, but this is also not asceticism, right? I mean, it's meat and something sweet, and so why exactly he ate those things, and whether he only ever ate those things or whether he survived on those things for a period when he was on his own in the wilderness, and so now even when he has other food options, it's still characteristic and people are still telling those stories about him. A lot of that's unclear, right? And I certainly couldn't answer every question that I would have loved to be able to about John the Baptist, but I do think that in terms of his clothing, he was, I like to say as a fan, you can also see behind me, in addition to the John the Baptist figurine, I also have like Star Trek ships and other things there. And so I like to say that John was cosplaying the prophet Elijah, essentially, right? And Elijah, in his time, was somebody who was challenging, in particular, the king, right, and his wife, and was shaking things up, challenging the way things were done religiously, the religious establishment. And I think that people in John's time got what he was doing through that. And so, yeah, I mean, the shaggy mane might be right, and we might talk more about his haircut or lack thereof. But certainly, I think in terms of the clothing, it was not dressing like a caveman.
Yeah, or he's not. I think there's another analog, and this is also something that's super going to resonate with young people if there are any listening. But I think it was Ernest P. Worrell, the mountain man character from the Andy Griffith Show, who would come into town and cause trouble, and he didn't really follow the rules. You're saying John the Baptist was not, I guess, like a reclusive derelict in that sense that I think a lot of people picture him. But there was, so along with the appearance and what he was eating and the association or presence in the wilderness, there was a rejection of, I guess, his family or family calling, vocation, because of someone. So there's some conflict possibly in his household that is also him challenging not just the king, but the temple infrastructure and that whole system. I'm trying to bunch as many things as I
Yeah,
can in here because it
yeah,
seems like there's so
sure.
many things connected, and you do discuss that
Yeah,
in the book.
yeah, and he's challenging. When he's challenging Herod Antipas, right? His father had been king, and Herod Antipas petitioned three different, successive Roman emperors asking to be appointed as king, and they kept telling him no. And so I'm sure that annoyed him to no end. And then he has this person who's challenging his legitimacy. I mean, not unlike you have, if we went back to the story of Elijah, right? I mean, uh, King Ahab, things were on the decline in his time, right? I mean, his father had been great. Omri had done all these building projects, a lot like Herod the Great, and then you have this son who's not quite able to, so there's some interesting analogies there. And I don't get into all those details in the book, but yeah, I was also struck at one point working on this by the fact that John, if if we merely didn't see him going into his father's profession, practicing as a priest, priests were called to actual service in the temple relatively infrequently. They usually did other things. They didn't usually do what John did, right? In fact, we don't know of anyone else who did exactly what John did. But that he would have some other line of work would not have been surprising. But he doesn't merely not do that as far as we can see. He's offering a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, which sounds like it's offering what the temple and its sacrifices offer, but offering it freely. And so he's like a son who basically sets up a competing business trying to put his father out of business, right? And I quickly realized, I was like, whoa, there's got to be a really interesting family backstory here, right? And I was pretty sure that was going to be another one of those questions that I list as it would be great if we could figure this out, right? Maybe offer some speculation. But then I realized that there actually was something that is implicit and at times explicit in the sources that we have that might make sense of it, right? So we mentioned John's hair, right? The Hagrid look. And there were people who, at least for a time, took a vow, right? They were known as Nazarites, and they would refrain from cutting their hair. We have two stories in the Jewish scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, about men who were dedicated as lifelong Nazarites, right, by their mothers. And so we have Samson and we have Samuel. And being a Nazarite included not cutting your hair and refraining from partaking in alcoholic beverages. And we have that latter explicitly mentioned, right, in the infancy story in the Gospel of Luke. And a lot of times people treat those details as though they're just Luke imitating his source material, right? And he certainly is, right? He is patterning the way he tells his infancy story about John the Baptist and Jesus on the stories of Samson and Samuel. But if John was not a figure who fit into that category, then people would have known that, right? And if he was publicly, right, visibly, like, this guy looks like he's never cut his hair. Oh, I bet I know why. And so even without it being explicitly stated, this was something that was part of sort of visible history. And so while a lot of times details in infancy stories, a historian can't really do much with them because, even if they're not making miraculous claims, they're often about things that happen outside of public view, and so you may not have confirmation and things. But here we have something that, I think a historian could legitimately latch onto and say there's a basis for this. What I don't think anyone else working on John the Baptist noticed, because it's not the sort of thing that would ever normally come up except in his case, is that priests had a requirement to keep their hair trimmed, right, neat and tidy. And in fact, the Hebrew wording of the commandments regarding Nazarites and regarding priests use the same terminology, just one is not, right? So your hair is kempt, your hair is unkempt. Right? And so what that means is that if you're dedicated as a lifelong Nazarite, then you cannot also be a practicing priest. And suddenly I realized this might, if John's mother, right, as per the infancy traditions in Luke, had been getting on in years and had still not had a child, she could well have done what so many readers of the scriptures do, which is to find herself in these stories and say, God, do for me what you did for these our ancestors, right? And if you do this for me, I will do with my child what they did with theirs and dedicate him. And suddenly we have potentially John the Baptist caught between his mother's vow and his father's profession and his ancestry on his father's side. And that might potentially, it seemed to me, be something where there's enough of it that would have been public knowledge that we could have reason to feel confident in it, right, when it comes to the historical conclusion. And it would make sense of, how does this person who is the son of a priest end up offering an alternative means of forgiveness to what the temple offers, right? Why would someone, certainly we get the impression John had a powerful sense of calling, right, from God. But I don't think there's any antithesis between having a powerful sense of calling and sense of vocation and there being a personal story and journey that is crucial to understanding oneself in that way and discovering a path for oneself. And so I think that this actually makes a lot of sense and helps us to figure some things out about John that have long puzzled us. Or, in the best case scenario, scholars have been puzzled by them. In the worst case, sometimes we haven't even thought to ask the question.
So I kind of I'm having a thought about historiography here. So I'll do my best to squeeze a question out of this thought, but bear with me for a moment. So I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Robert Caro has this, I think it's a 4-part biography of Lyndon Johnson. And there's always, for the first book, there's this pretty long history of the Texas Hill Country. And there's this, to contextualize the Johnson family. And there's this, a retelling of the history of the Populist Party in American agrarian communities and how that affected the politics of 20th century America. And then there, the book about the Senate, there's like a 125-page recap of the history of the Senate. And he does this to frame, here's how you can understand this person, this figure. So I think what I'm hearing is you're saying that the actual person, Elizabeth, probably understood herself as similar to Samuel's mother or Samson's mother. But is this also something that we can attribute to the author of Luke or the author of any other ancient biography to say that they're trying to give you a context or a framework for understanding the person we're talking about? So that could be John the Baptist, who is actually in the Gospels part of the framework to understand Jesus. I hope that's a helpful question.
Yeah, and I think there are two things that you mentioned that are important. One is, putting John in his context, right, and recognizing that, to the extent that we can figure things out about the relationship between the priesthood, the populace, Herod Antipas, the diversity of views that exist in this time, what were people debating, what were people trying to figure out, what were they frustrated by, that can help us make sense of John. Uh, we get some figures who are promising sort of deliverance, right, throughout this era in history. And one reason for that is that it seemed like yet another fulfillment was of something that had been promised was long overdue, right? So in response to, after 70 years of Babylonian exile, there's still, people from Judah scattered all over the place, and the temple's been rebuilt, but it's, people are disappointed with it. It's not like the one from the era of the monarchy. And so there's this sense that something still needs to happen. And so the book of Daniel says, well, it's going to be 70 weeks of years, right? Because, and that's what it's going to take to finally eliminate, the sin among the people, and to, get the people ready so that then the promises can be fulfilled. And people in John's time had been doing the calculations, and were like, yeah, the time, that seems to have expired just recently, and we had a ruling family over us, but it wasn't of the line of David, and they took the line of priests, right, the Hasmoneans, and then they came to an end, and now we have Herod, and where is the fulfillment, right? And so I think that sort of context, can give us a lot that will help us to make sense of John. But unlike the people who are coming along and saying, don't worry, deliverance is at hand, right? Just get yourselves ready. He was saying, get yourselves ready, get your act together. God's going to give you one more chance, because, the reason this stuff hasn't happened is because we're not, we're such a mess, right? And so in that sense, he's a bit of a doom and gloom figure, but not an entirely negative one, right? To have attracted audiences of Pharisees and tax collectors, or not so much Pharisees. They came and asked him some questions, but tax collectors and prostitutes are supposed to come. And not every preacher of doom and gloom manages to connect with either tax collectors or prostitutes as an audience. And so there's something about John. I think he was a lot more charismatic, witty, sharp wit on him, colorful character that was engaging and powerful in that way. But anyway, so then I think as well that looking at the family context then, right? So looking at, what we can figure out about Zechariah and Elizabeth, we get the sense that they're both pious individuals, but precisely through expressing their piety, right? We have a priest who wants his son to be a priest. I mean, it's not even a question of, are you going to follow in my footsteps? It's sort of automatic, right? If you have a male child, they are a priest, right? Because it's by descent. And yet, if the mother has made this vow, then one of the things that John might have realized is that the Torah, right, the Jewish law, is more complex, and maybe not entirely a perfect God-given revelation of everything one needs to know in every sense and answering all questions, because a commandment like honor your father and mother, what happens if your father and mother are pulling you in different directions? Right? And in a patriarchal society, you might say, well, then obviously you side with the father. But the text doesn't say that, right? It says honor your father and mother, and 9 times out of 10, you are probably, one path will manage to do both and accomplish both things. But there are times when that's not the case. And so I think that's one reason why we see him looking in the scriptures and discovering this complexity to it, right? That there are debates within the scriptures, right? That in fact you have people like Samuel, right, who was another case like his, and yet Samuel offered sacrifices, even though he was not of priestly descent. And so clearly there was an era in the past of the people when things had been different. And you look closely at even the building of the temple, and while God blesses it, there's also this, I don't dwell in houses made with human hands, right? And there's this language about it that suggests that the temple is in real danger of becoming an idol, right, from the outset, and of giving the sense that God is going to be present in the city of Jerusalem and closer to you there than anywhere else. And so you lose the era of the tabernacle, right, going where people are. You lose the era of, a prophet potentially appearing and, bringing God's word directly to you in some other place. And I think that John discovered some of the richness of his own tradition, but not what was always played up in the dominant forms of piety and expressions of religiosity in his time.
So I recently read Seconding Sinai by Hindi Naiman. And that, okay, so there's this whole idea in there, and I wonder if it resonates at all with how you're talking about John, of we need to be careful with the anachronistic idea of saying, when someone writes in someone else's name in the ancient world, or speaks, that it's fraud. It's automatically what we would call, cheating or fraud or plagiarism or whatever, but that they are appealing to a tradition. And she camps out a lot in the Mosaic tradition as it applies to Second Temple Judaism and so on. So that's where we are. We're in Second Temple. So we see John and Jesus challenging the temple, challenging the world, and calling to people for forgiveness. And are you saying they're calling on a tradition that's like deeper than the superficial tradition around them?
Yeah, and I don't want to say that one is necessarily deep and the other is superficial, but I think most expressions of piety that have a scripture that is a collection, such as the Bible is, are going to focus more on some parts than on others. I think that's inevitable. And oftentimes, something interesting happens. There's some innovation that happens. It may be in response to new things that are going on in the person's time, but often it's also a result of going and looking and saying, "Wow, in relation to that, I'm noticing this other thing in this text that I hadn't really thought about before." And so, I think that John certainly would have said that there was some superficial piety in his time. I think, though, that's true probably in every era. There's some of that, and so it certainly wasn't anything unique to his time.
So thank you for correcting me on that. So, okay, I probably functional. So the way that engagement with worshiping God, the way that they believed to, the functional approach that had come along. And I use superficial to mean like, this is what we see and what we see, but
Mhm.
but that it didn't serve the, and when I mean deeper, I wasn't
Yeah.
using those in the judgmental kind of ways of saying like
Okay.
deeper
Yeah.
as in good.
Sorry. I
No,
should.
it was, no, I used the wrong words. So I would say more foundational. So looking at
Hmm.
the foundational tradition and appealing to the idea that whether it's Samuel or Moses, or however we need to frame that, depending on where John is and what he's talking about, that his role is saying, hey, if this is supposed to exist for us to engage with our God in a system where there's forgiveness, and that's what we exist for, that's what our community exists for, or the observance of this is for, there's a better way to do that that serves the people in the way that I think God intended for it to be. But you're not undermining the initial tradition. You're in fact
Hmm.
appealing to the initial tradition. So, but I truly do mean thank you for correcting that. That was lazy and sloppy of me.
Well, no, I mean, superficial can mean surface level in the sense that that's what's apparent, but can also mean superficial as like there's not much depth to it, and I took you the wrong way. And so I'm glad at the very least it gave you a chance to clarify what you meant. Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's interesting. John the Baptist was a very big influence, more so than I think we tend to do justice to, even though, he's right there early in the Gospels, on Jesus, on early Christianity. And if we look at Christianity, I think we can tell more about John from doing that, looking at Jesus, looking at Christianity, than has typically been the case, right? Because most people are looking at John to tell them about Jesus and Christianity and not doing the reverse. And I think that reversing the direction of attention, even if your main interest is Jesus and Christianity, will help you, figure this stuff out a bit better. And we see the prophets quoted a lot more, right, in the Christian sources, right? And so, we can go back to, figures like Amos, who are living in this era in which they're challenging the uh, the way that things are done in the society, challenging those who are in charge, calling people out for, injustice and things of that sort, but also criticizing sacrifice and not necessarily saying, sacrifice should be abolished or that it can't be a way of connecting with God, but recognizing that people were worshiping and practicing injustice, right? And so, and they were offering sacrifices and sometimes maybe felt free to get away with things because they were constantly seeking God's forgiveness. And so it's, and I think that in addition to the problem of that was woven into the prophetic tradition already, John probably was thinking, if you live far away from this temple, then it's more expensive for you to sin than if you live close. And there's something, there's something not quite right with not necessarily the institution itself, although he may have said that, but with, at the very least, what it's become, what it can become, what it can be and represent in the minds of people.
So I want to make sure we touch on this point. So I think my understanding of John the Baptist coming up in church was kind of along the lines of he's like the cold open for Jesus, and then at the end he's like, live from New York, it's Saturday night, and gets his head cut off, and then that's the end of it. But so there's an encounter that I always understood to be at the end of Jesus' life that what you talk about in the book is Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple happened early in his time, and you're suggesting like John is not gone yet. Is that correct?
I think that's at the very least a possibility that we should consider more so than we sometimes have, and that we should, I think the most important thing is to connect it with John the Baptist, right? So there's debate among scholars and historians about whether the timing of that event in the Gospel of John is more accurate or what we have in the other Gospels. And sometimes people will sort of lazily say, oh, well, it's 3 against 1, Matthew, Mark, and Luke against John, and so they're probably right. But in fact, 1 against 1, if we take into account the way that scholars usually understand the literary relationship between those Gospels. And so we have Mark writing first and placing it at the end, in the only place that he could put it in his Gospel, because he only narrates that one visit of Jesus to Jerusalem. Whereas the Gospel of John has Jesus visiting Jerusalem many times, and also has Jesus and John the Baptist active at the same time, right? And I think that when we put the Gospel of John and the Synoptics together at this point, actually a lot of things start to make a lot more sense, right? And they complement each other. Because after Jesus does the action in the temple in the other Gospels, there's very soon after a question of his authority, right? The authorities in Jerusalem ask him, by what authority do you do these things? And he says, okay, I'll ask you one question, and if you answer me, then I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. John's baptism, right? From heaven or from human beings? So he connects the question about his authority with John the Baptist, right? That's immediately where he goes with that. And so I think that, at least in the Gospel of John, with John the Baptist still being active, this action, historically speaking, can be seen as an expression of John the Baptist's movement, right? That this was the kind of thing that you would expect to emerge out of it, that you expect one of John's group to deliver as a message from John or representing John and his teaching. And given that John the Baptist is offering an alternative means of forgiveness to the temple, also talking about the temple's demise, right, is kind of fitting and can help us fill in something of that picture. The one detail in the Gospel of John that I think often doesn't get enough significant attention and get the weight it deserves is that in challenging Jesus, he says that the temple will be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days, something that he's also accused of saying in the other Gospels, but they kind of distance Jesus from it. And then the response in the Gospel of John is, it's taken 46 years and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days. And if we look at when Herod the Great started work on that, on the sort of renovation of the temple, his building project, right, you go 46 years later and you are basically in a time period before a 3-year ministry or 1-year ministry or however much of Jesus. And the timing actually fits sort of an earlier date rather than right before, basically a week before the crucifixion or something like that. And so the fact that information is in there, it doesn't need to be in there. And if this is just some author writing later and making up a date. Why that date? And so it's an interesting detail, which even if one thinks that the Gospel of John is significantly later, there's also the possibility that it has some significant source material that's woven into it that might take us back to historical things. And so, without in any way denying the fact that Jesus, John the Baptist, the narrator, all sort of speak in the same way in the Gospel of John, and so there are challenges to using it, if one's asking historical questions. I think there's a lot more that's historically useful in the Gospel of John than at least some historians take seriously.
So I want to. This is another one I'm going to make sure I get in there. Baptism. Okay. So did John invent it? Is there an antecedent? How is it similar or different to what we see throughout Christian history in baptism?
Yeah. So without John's baptism, presumably there would not be Christian baptism, right? Because we have John the Baptist, and then Jesus being baptized by John, and then Christian baptism. And so the earliest source material we have connects these. If we ask, going back even a further step, what are the antecedents to John's baptism? We have John appearing on the scene in an era when, for some reason, it had become normative that to address purity, when the scriptures say to wash, that one immerses oneself fully. Right? There are lots of ways of washing and of washing oneself that do not involve full immersion. And so this is a very striking development. And we see it in the archaeological record. We have what's known as a mikveh, right? An immersion pool. And we have these appearing and becoming more and more common in the archaeological record. And then we also have Greek and Roman baths spreading to the region. And it may be because of the one, that we get the popularity of the other, right? But more people are immersing themselves in this time than in this part of the world than probably ever before in history. And somehow John manages to get the nickname John the Baptist. And so I think that what he's doing has to be something other than either being a fan of Greek bathing or Roman bathing, or someone who's saying, do more purity immersions, or do them better, or do them slightly, it still wouldn't give you the nickname John the Baptist, I don't think. And so I think that John was taking this powerful imagery, right? Because this imagery of flowing water, you get a lot of it in scripture. It's one reason why I think the purity movement, developed as it did in that time. But he's harnessing this imagery that's woven through the scriptures in various places and using it to offer something else, right? To address not just ritual defilement, but to address sin and the need for forgiveness. And so, on the one hand, clearly, when we get to Christian baptism, that it can be so hard to figure out what Christian baptism looked like in the very earliest days, because we had so many developments in the practice of baptism, between Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, the Protestant Reformation. Baptism and how you baptize has been such a matter of debate. But I think that we can nonetheless triangulate back at least a little bit, and we can be certain that on the one hand, being united with Jesus in his death and resurrection, as in Paul's language about baptism, was not what John was talking about, right? Because it was too soon for that. But on the other hand, there is that sense of kind of being mystically connected, right? That's part of that. You're incorporated into Christ and therefore into his death and resurrection through baptism. And that, I think, may have been part of John's activity, that he didn't just want people to treat it like sacrifice where you come in and you do this thing and you get forgiveness and then you go home and then you come back the next day and do it again. I think he wanted people to have a powerful spiritual experience in connection with baptism. And I think that some people certainly did.
It really does seem like an activity that, I mean, I grew up Baptist, so it's easy for me to say this, that, you kind of take advantage, or you take for granted. Yeah, you take it for granted that it's always been this way. But the idea that it came from something else and it had this meaning and it, it's not, I think that the idea that these kinds of things, baptism, the Eucharist, stuff like that in the Christian tradition, that they're just symbols. I don't know. I think symbols are pretty important, and participatory symbols even more so. So because we're coming up on time, I want to make sure I get these last few questions. So is there something in the book that you were hoping I would ask about that I didn't? And then there's a lot that I didn't ask about. Was there something you were like, I hope Jared asked about this?
Yeah, well, maybe I should say something, and I'll try and also take a quick look at the made some notes after you sent me some questions about things that you might ask about. But I mean, I think I'll say one thing is that Christmaker: Life of John the Baptist is written to be like a readable life story of John the Baptist. And there have been people who've said that that could not be done. We didn't have enough information to go on. And I think that by bringing in, as much as we could from his context, putting together some pieces and connecting some dots in what we're told about him, and recognizing that because of the close connection with Jesus, looking at Jesus, we actually can figure out more about John than we have, has allowed me to fill some of that in. But I said at the beginning that this was the first time I wrote 2 books as part of one of these projects. And I'm so happy I did that for the first time that I probably will do that again, not in every project that I do, but certainly when I have something that's similarly needing of detailed scholarly analysis, but also general audience communication. In the past, I've tended to try to write one book and hope that it would be of interest to anyone and everyone. And I think inevitably, it's, Murphy's Law kicked into effect. If you try to please everyone, no one will like it. Some people seem to have liked some of the things I've written, but I'm sure that other people would have liked them if they'd been separate books and were aimed more at the target audience. But what I will say is that, for things like the invention of baptism, right, which we don't even think to ask, right, as somebody who's settled in the Baptist tradition himself, we don't even think it's just there, right? It's part of the tradition. And where did John come up with the idea? Well, God inspired him. Okay, but it's connected to things that were going on at the time, and it's not why this symbol, right? We should be able to make sense of it historically. And there's a chapter in the big book on inventing baptism, right, that really tries to dig into what might some of the influences on John have been, including some that are I think really, really have a really, really strong case and were probably part of it. But I think because the imagery of water and cleansing through water and things like that is so widespread in the scriptures, that there might have been multiple texts and multiple influences that could have been part of it. And one that I didn't envisage exploring when I started on the project, but eventually did, is the possibility that there might be some connection with the imagery of the flood, which sometimes gets connected with Christian baptism, right? You certainly get saved through baptism already in the New Testament, as also in the days of Noah, right? You get that analogy. The flood was understood to have sort of cleansed the earth, right, in judgment, right, and was also connected with one of the popular origin stories for unclean spirits. And so the possibility that sort of that flood imagery, a practice of exorcism, things like that, which we know Jesus also was associated with, might have been part of it. There are all kinds of possibilities that I think we could even find Christian baptism and the way it was understood becomes clearer, and some of its resonances become clearer when we're aware that, let's say, many more ancient preachers preaching baptismal sermons touched on these texts than tend to be the case in any church today, right? Never mind the one that you or I necessarily has had some experience with. And so hopefully I've given some resources for exploring some of those possible connections that run from John backwards into the Jewish scriptures, Christian Old Testament, run sideways between John and other things going on in his time, and runs forward into, certainly Mandaeism as well, but also, in particular, Christianity. And so if somebody is interested in understanding Jesus better, understanding Christian origins, I'm genuinely hopeful that this book, even if its focus seems to be like too early and sort of it's just focusing on the cold open, the opening act, that in fact it actually does help you understand, the show as a whole, if you're a Christian looking for that.
I really enjoyed the book, and so I highly encourage anyone who's hearing this to get this book when it's available. But in addition to this book, where do you think people should go to learn more about John the Baptist?
Yeah, so there have been several, really interesting books and studies in recent years. Joan Taylor's study, The Immerser. There's a recent one by Joel Marcus, John the Baptist. And although I disagree with both of them on some points, I think there hasn't been so much attention that, I have like great confidence that I'm right and everybody else has gotten things wrong. I'm trying to be creative in these books. And what I've said to people, very early on is, it's like I might be wrong about some things. If I'm right about even a couple of them, then this is groundbreaking and important. But the one thing I can guarantee you is not that I'm right, but that you won't be bored with what I'm presenting, because I've managed to come up with some different and innovative ways of reading what are really some very familiar stories, or at least should be, even if our tendency is in fact to breeze past them a little faster than we should. And so there are other scholars, but those are two that have sort of book length. There's some fascinating stuff by Edmondo Lupieri on sort of John the Baptist as a figure, not just in the New Testament, but in Mandaeism. And if people are interested, I work with linguist Charles Heberl on an edition of a work known as the Mandaean Book of John. And that's John the Baptist, right? So it's not a version of the Gospel of John. And if people are interested in finding out, so what do these folks think about John the Baptist and Jesus? If you're coming from a Christian perspective, then this is going to be a viewpoint that you're not going to like very much necessarily. It's one that disagrees with you. As is also true of Jews and Christians. There have been historic disagreements, and yet we can get along just fine and in the present day. And Mandaeans are actually really friendly folks, so do want to give them a shout out in that regard. But woven into their tradition is this other viewpoint. And if somebody's interested in saying, okay, so what do these texts actually say? Because this sounds fascinating. I hadn't heard of these folks, right? It's living Gnostic group. You can go on YouTube and see their baptismal practice. So the translation, right, not the commentary and all that other detailed stuff, which I definitely recommend anyone interested get the print book for their local library, have them pay the money that it costs for these expensive academic volumes.
Because it's a chunk of change.
Yeah, but the translation itself is available online, open access. We got a grant from the NEH in order to fund the project, and that helped make that possible. And so, read these things, explore them, think about them.
And I'll have that URL in the show notes for listeners who are interested in checking those things out. What do you read for fun?
Mostly science fiction. And of course, I have turned everything I love into work, but I get to, for work, do things that I love. So, you could view it as a negative, but I find it positive. But yeah, so I do that, and I do teach on science fiction and write things about it as well. So I have audiobooks on in the car, and that's how I find time for fun and fiction. And so what I've actually been listening to just of late is Making It So, Patrick Stewart's memoir. So,
Okay.
and that's been fascinating. So that's not sci-fi, but it obviously has a sci-fi connection.
It's certainly sci-fi adjacent. There's
Yeah.
not much modern sci-fi without Patrick Stewart, I think. Is there recent sci-fi that you would point to for people to read?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And some of it engages with religion in all kinds of interesting ways. In fact, I should probably just get out the Libby app, which is what I use. So if there are listeners who don't know that their public library might actually let them not merely check out books, but get them straight onto their phone, right, without even having to do any additional effort. So let's see. What I've listened to recently include Shishin Liu's trilogy. So it starts with Three Body Problem, which was recently made into a Netflix series. And then listen to Hugh Howey's novels. Let's see, it starts with, is it Wool, Sand and Dust? It's the ones that were turned into Silo.
Okay.
Right, which is a series. Before that, because I'm teaching a course this semester on sort of religion and science fiction with a focus on climate dystopia, listen to The Deluge by Stephen Markley. And then also there was another one that was interesting that was also a sort of a near future sci-fi one. Termination Shock by Neil Stephenson. And that was interesting. So, yeah, I do a lot of this kind of stuff.
That's awesome. Yeah, look, sci-fi's fun, man. The Expanse or
Yeah.
Adrian Tchaikovsky. There's so much good sci-fi out there
Yeah.
right now.
Becky Chambers is another one that does. So there's some stuff by her that's got some interesting religious elements in it. So
Cool. Okay. And, I mean, well, what else? What else do you do to like decompress? That does it. Do you ever let work go? Do you ever leave it at the office?
I don't know, because I managed to connect these things. So I even, I even have, I start because I love music, and so do music stuff at church sometimes. Have jammed and even done music on campus with colleagues and fun things like that. But yeah, I always seem to manage to bring it into, if I enjoy doing it, I try and make it part of what I do in teaching. So I made parody songs in the interest of trying to facilitate student learning, and then even made one to promote my last book. And so I'm trying to see if I can come up with one for this book or these books as well.
Nice. So when this question, the what do you read for fun, that came up because someone didn't feel like calling out any other biblical studies experts specifically. So I was like, just in the spur of the moment, I was like, well, what do you read for fun then? And I was like, I'll just ask them that. And then I really liked the question and I kept going. But when I told a friend of mine, my friend Daniel, hey, I think I'm going to start asking this question to everybody, he's like, well, get ready to hear, I don't read for fun because I have to read too much for work. And he has been wrong. You guys, whether it's like, well, look, I have little ones at home, so I read children's books. It's hey, what do you enjoy? How about sports? Are you a sports guy?
Not so much. I know that's going to disappoint some people who know I'm at Butler University, where I'm supposed to, be, at least basketball, following it more avidly than I am.
Oh yeah, because Indiana.
Yeah. So, but I mean, the excuse. I mean, I was always more of a nerd, but I and not a sports nerd, but the other kind of nerd.
Yeah.
But I think I also have a decent excuse that I spent more than a decade living out of the country, and that's enough to sort of disconnect you from sports in your home country, unless those sports are played everywhere around the world, which neither baseball nor American football is to the same extent. And so I learned about cricket and what Americans call soccer and rugby and a few other things more. But yeah.
Well, I appreciate you being here. This has been a pleasure. The book was really good. I can't wait to read John of History. I'm looking forward to that too when that one comes out. So thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Jared. It's been wonderful talking with you, and I hope we have a chance to talk again.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and rate the podcast on your favorite platform. If you are interested in following, supporting, or engaging with the podcast anywhere else, check out the link tree that I've hyperlinked in the show notes. I try to put episodes out as soon as possible for $5 a month on Patreon. So if there's something that I've announced or you've seen on social media, just know $5 a month, you can listen to every episode that I have edited. Take care.